Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Those of you who have not followed this series, we are now on chapter 4, and in this chapter, Paulo Freire discusses first the 4 strategies used by the anti-dialogical forces to keep us in our place. We have concluded our discussion of conquest, divide and rule, and manipulation. And this video is a continuation of my reading and discussion of the 4th constituent part of the anti-dialogical system, which is cultural invasion. Now, in the previous video, in which I had started the discussion of cultural invasion, towards the end of my reading and discussion, Freire is moving into the discussion of creation of human subjectivities within an oppressive system through Erich Fromm, and that is escape from freedom. And so the passages that I will read are Freire's unpacking of what he gleans from Erich Fromm. And my hope is that after I read these passages and we have a brief conversation about it, you will clearly understand why is he using Fromm and why is it important to understand that within the context of cultural invasion, what does it do, but also within the larger context of the book, which is to create revolutionary consciousness or consciousnesses that are not overdetermined by the very system that they are trying to change or overthrow. So let's read first, and then we'll come back and have a brief conversation about it. Presenting with his customary clarity the problem of necrophilia and biophilia, Fromm analyzes the objective conditions which generate each condition. Whether in the home, parent-child relations in a climate of indifference and oppression or of love and freedom, or in a socio-cultural context. If children reared in an atmosphere of lovelessness and oppression, children whose potency has been frustrated do not manage during their youth to take the path of authentic rebellion, they will either drift into total indifference, alienated from reality by the authorities and the myths the latter have used to shape them, or they may engage in forms of destructive action. The atmosphere of the home is prolonged in the school, where the students soon discover that, as in the home, in order to achieve some satisfaction, they must adapt to the precepts which have been set from above. One of these precepts is not to think. Internalizing paternal authority through the rigid relationship structure emphasized by the school, these young people tend, when they become professionals, because of the very fear of freedom instilled by these relationships, to repeat the rigid patterns in which they were miseducated. This phenomena, in addition to their class position, perhaps explains why so many professionals adhere to anti-dialogical action. Whatever the specialty that brings them into contact with the people, they are almost unshakably convinced that it is their mission to give the latter their knowledge and techniques. They see themselves as promoters of the people. Their programs of action, which might have been prescribed by any good theorists of oppressive action, include their own objectives, their own convictions, and their own preoccupations. They do not listen to the people, but instead plan to teach them how to cast off the laziness which creates underdevelopment. To these professionals, it seems absurd to consider the necessity of respecting the view of the world held by the people. The professionals are the one with a worldview. They regard as equally absurd the affirmation that one must necessarily consult the people when organizing the program content of educational action. They feel that the ignorance of the people is so complete that they are unfit for anything except to receive the teachings of the professionals. When, however, at a certain point of their existential experience, those who have been invaded begin in one way or another to reject this invasion, to which they might earlier have adapted, the professionals, in order to justify their failure, say that the members of the invaded group are inferior because they are ingrates, shiftless, diseased, or of mixed blood. Well intentioned professionals, those who use invasion not as a deliberate ideology but as the expression of their own upbringing, eventually discover that certain of their educational failures must be ascribed not to the intrinsic inferiority of the simple men of the people, but to the violence of their own act of invasion. Those who make this discovery face a difficult alternative. They feel the need to renounce invasion, but patterns of domination are so entrenched within them that this renunciation would become a threat to their own identities. To renounce invasion would mean ending their dual status as dominated and dominators. It would mean abandoning all myths which nourish invasion and starting to incarnate dialogical action. For this very reason, it would mean to cease being over or inside as foreigners in order to be with as comrades. And so the fear of freedom takes hold of these men. During this traumatic process, they naturally tend to rationalize their fear with a series of evasions. The fear of freedom is greater still in professionals who have not yet discovered for themselves the invasive nature of their action, and who are told that their action is dehumanizing. Not frequently, especially at the point of decoding concrete situations, training course participants ask the coordinator in an irritated manner, "Where do you think you are steering us anyway?" The coordinator isn't trying to steer them anywhere. It is just that in facing a concrete situation as a problem, the participants begin to realize that if their analysis of the situation goes any deeper, they will either have to divest themselves of their myths or reaffirm them. Divesting themselves of and renouncing their myths represents, at that moment, an act of self violence. On the other hand, to reaffirm those myths is to reveal themselves. The only way out, which functions as a defense mechanism, is to project onto the coordinator their own usual practices: steering, conquering, and invading. Now, in the previous video, towards the end of my discussion of the reading, we had moved into where Freire, through Erich Fromm, is now trying to educate us about the structural aspects of identity formation, right? So his example there was that the kind of relationships our parents, first of all, experience outside in the world. If it is a hierarchical, oppressive order, and if that's the only model that they know, they will replicate it within the confines of the home. And children who are developing their idea of self and their identities will then develop their individual and social identities within that system. And that's crucial to keep in mind. And the reason, of course, he's going to Erich Fromm is that most of his work, especially the psychological aspects of it, come from Erich Fromm. And now Fromm is most famous for his book Escape from Freedom, which he wrote post-war. And it basically tries to trace why is it that even though we as human beings and cultures post-war have defeated totalitarianism, Nazism, but there is a tendency in human individuals and groups to be afraid of the responsibilities that come with freedom. The need to make choices, make decisions. So it becomes easier to buy into a system, become part of a larger group, and let them dictate what our behavior ought to be. That is what he defines as fear of freedom. A lot of populist movements today depend on that. And that is the beginning of totalitarianism and fascism, when we give the decision-making powers to those we consider above us or better than us. Right? What Freire is saying in these passages is that what Fromm talks about in the family also continues in the educational system. And if the educational system is hierarchical and oppressive, then the students studying in it will internalize that as a normal, natural system, and that's how their social identities will be formed. I mean, what we are trying to learn is that how does cultural invasion shape our consciousnesses in which we become passive subjects of a dictatorial system. So childhood upbringing is part of it, but education is another part of it, especially the kind of education that doesn't encourage questioning and that believes that the educators have the knowledge and we ought to pour that knowledge down into our students. And that's why he's going in those passages where, let's say, these colonial educators or those who are specialists in education, they are given missions to educate the poor, right? And then towards the end, they end up blaming the people they are trying to educate because their system doesn't work and it keeps failing. And the easiest path is to blame the people. They are ingrates. There are so many instances you can see in the British writings of India where, the British officials would tell you these people are incurable, they are unteachable. The famous poem by Kipling, The White Man's Burden, tells you that these are sullen people, they are ungrateful, all your efforts will go to waste. And then towards the end of the passages that I read to you, he is not talking about educators in interaction with the people. He's talking about when the people who become professionals, they themselves are being trained, they have two options. As they are being trained, they have the option to question what is being passed down to them as truth. And if they do that, their self will come to crisis because they would realize, no, this is because we have conquered these people. This is the reason we are trying to perpetuate that. And since that is terrifying because it is kind of a refutation of your identity, most of these people will suppress that. And then there is a moment where he stages the questioning. What if someone in the training questions it? What happens then, right? And it would mean abandoning all the myths which nourish invasion. So if you start questioning your own training as a specialist, that means you have to question the mythologies of superiority, racial, educational, scientific superiority. And if you do that, since yourself is structured on those mythologies, it will come across as an attack to your own self, right? And unless you do that, unless you reconstruct another self as a trainer then, as an educator, you will carry within you the seeds of the oppressive cultural invading system that trained you. It is not possible for you to give the kind of education, not give, but to share the kind of education in which those you're educating are active participants. That's all we've been talking about during this long reading of the book. Now there is a footnote, one of them is important, which is footnote 31, and that says it perhaps also explains the anti-dialogical behavior of persons who, although convinced of their revolutionary commitment, continue to mistrust the people and fear communion with them. Unconsciously, such persons retain the oppressor within themselves. And because they house the master, they fear freedom. So sometimes there could be people who are committed to an act of revolution, but they are still afraid of hearing people out, hearing their grievances, or assigning them or ascribing to them certain degree of intelligence and understanding of their own lives. And the reason behind that is because their own identities are still carrying the remnants of the oppressive system, the conquest system that created them. Now, in the beginning of these passages that I read, there were two terms from Fromm that he employs, necrophilia and biophilia. Okay, and it's very simple. Necrophilia is the kind of psychology, the kind of way of thinking and consciousness that believes in destruction, right, and death. And biophilia is the life-giving way of looking at life, right, where you love life and the world in which we live, the environment in which we live. Remember, like in chapter 3, we discussed that one part of creating the curriculum is to go and see the thematic universe in which people live, right, and then privilege their lived experience to know what is it that they know of the world and why do they think about it the way they do. So this is roughly my conversation about these two passages that we just read. He's going into now, in cultural invasion, trying to trace that how is it that well-meaning people come to these communities of the poor and end up blaming them for the failure of the trainers or people who are trying to do good. And the reason behind it is that the method is wrong. And the assumptions and mythologies are still the mythologies and assumptions of the conquerors. And he's also trying to trace how does that private psyche in the home sphere, but through education, how do we create people who believe that theirs is a certain station in the world? But also how demagogues come to be. You know, if people don't ask questions, if they internalize this idea that this leader or that leader has superior intelligence and knows the world better than them, then it's easier to manipulate them. It's easier to lead them to the interest of the people, sometimes against their own interest. What we are trying to accomplish through Freire is an understanding of how to avoid that. If there is going to be a revolutionary movement, it cannot be top-down. And we can't say, let's bring the revolution first and then we think of what to change. I mean, we've learned that in chapter 3. What we are trying to learn is how to make sure that that cultural invader part lodged in our souls is eradicated, and so that we do not blame the people for the failures of a program in which they did not have any say. So these are some words about this reading that I just did. I hope these are useful. Let me know what you think, and I will continue these efforts and try to finish the book as soon as possible. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, be generous, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.